The modern world's largest refugee population caught between a rock and a hard place, the dispossessed.
The Khyber Pass, the historic border between Afghanistan and the northwest frontier province of Pakistan. Over the past decade, this terrain has witnessed the modern world's biggest exodus of refugees, the Afghans. During the Soviet occupation of their country, 2 million Afghans fled to Iran. Another 3.5 million sought refuge here in Pakistan. Today, 1 in 4 of the world's refugees is an Afghan. Victims of the last great proxy war between the superpowers, they are now being forgotten. The world's attention has moved on.
The international community has forgotten Afghanistan. They don't give a damn about Afghanistan, unfortunately, because there are other demands on their attention. They have given generously, I believe, for over a decade. But when you look to an Afghan refugee child in Pakistan, in a refugee camp, and you look at a little kid out of Bangladesh who has just survived, barely survived, the cyclone, or you look at a poor refugee kid who is a Kurd, who is just becoming a refugee, therefore the attention of the world goes straight to Bangladesh and to the Kurds, because people have developed, rightly or wrongly, immunity towards Afghan refugees.
And they are still coming into Pakistan, but now they receive a mixed welcome. The UNHCR no longer registers them automatically. More than 300,000 Afghans do not qualify for UN rations, relying instead on charities and fellow refugees for food.
یو بوډ مور ته ولی شم دلته خو بوډ هم نشته دی سور هم نشته دی کله یو دیوال ته منډه کا او کله بل دیوال ته منډه کا سوځم نه خیمه لرم نه ښه لرم نه بد نو اول هغه پیدا شوی چې دلته کله چې راغلو یو خو شګه ده او هېڅ خاوره او شی چې نه وه او په اوله مرحله کې ډېر خلک سره مشکلات سره مخامخ بیا کوم زمان چې دا خلک مجبوره سو او دلته سره هغه سو نو خاوره او یو شی سره پیدا کړله او په قیمت سره واخیستله یې کنې دلته دې ځای خاوره نه درلوده او بیا هم تر یوې اندازې پورې یوه نیمه کوټه چې جوړه کړله دغه 3-4 میاشتې ښکور مخکې بیا بالاخره له اوبو سره ډېر زیات مشکلات وو حتی تر دې اندازې پورې چې یو وخت کې دلته راغله داسې ورونه له ماټ کې سره پوښتنه مو وکړله.
In Kashki camp, there's no shortage of mud or water. The melting snows of the Hindu Kush regularly flood the camp, driving its 8,000 inhabitants from their makeshift homes. Kashki is just one of 345 refugee camps spread across Pakistan's border provinces. After 12 years, they are effectively permanent settlements. In Peshawar, they've become cities within a city. The provincial capital now houses 3 times as many Afghans as Pakistanis. After 12 years, many Afghans have become well established. Unlike most refugees, those in the cities have access to jobs, education, and food. The generosity of their Islamic hosts has ensured that these are not the world's poorest refugees. But the younger generation has known no other life. Half of all Afghan refugees are now children who have never seen Afghanistan. These are a new generation of the dispossessed.
We are creating the beginnings of long-term Palestines for the future. There are populations now where children have lived entirely in camp settings. They've never been with parents who can take care of themselves, much less the children. And that breeds anger and a sense of powerlessness, which will simply turn around and bite us in the long run.
Inside Pakistan, rival Afghan factions are vying for control of a future Afghanistan. Their disunity has perpetuated the country's civil war and the plight of its refugees. But time is running out for the Afghans. Their continued presence is placing an intolerable strain on Pakistan. The international community is increasingly unwilling to support life in the camps. But as refugee numbers multiply across the world, there's now an urgent need to deal with the problem. One solution is apparently simple and obvious: repatriation, getting the refugees to go home.
Everybody in the refugee field and everybody in governments believes that ultimately it is best for most refugees to go home. There is no other solution for the great bulk of the world's refugees but to go home. But it's acknowledged that they need to go home when it's safe to do so and when they make the choice to do so.
Both these requirements were met by the organized airlift of Namibian refugees in 1989. Following a political settlement, UNHCR successfully sponsored the repatriation of 41,000 Namibians to their homeland. Repatriation is not always so welcome. In the same year, Hong Kong sent home 51 Vietnamese asylum seekers. This was forced repatriation in the middle of the night. The British-inspired experiment drew worldwide condemnation. It has not been repeated. When the Soviet army pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989, it raised hopes that the world's biggest refugee population could go home. The UN set up a new agency, UNOCA, and launched Operation Salam. The international community pledged almost $1 billion for the rehabilitation of Afghanistan and the return of its people. These trucks were bought to carry thousands of tons of aid to refugees once they had returned home. But for almost 12 months, the trucks have been standing idle in a compound outside Peshawar. The mass return never materialized. In a bid to promote repatriation, UNHCR began offering a package of money and food to Afghans who were willing to surrender their refugee status. So far, more than 100,000 have taken up the offer. In return for surrendering his family's ration pass, Mohammed will receive 300 kilograms of wheat and 3,300 rupees. By giving up his refugee status, he can now afford to return to Afghanistan to look after his grandchildren. But he cannot afford to come back. He has signed away all future rights to food aid by taking what UNHCR describes as a repatriation grant. The repatriation grant is about £90. Most Afghans prefer to stay as refugees.
About 100,000 people have taken advantage of it. About 100,000 people compared with 3 million from this side is just a trickle. But at the same time, it indicated that should we provide the proper incentives, there is willingness on the part of refugees to go back to their country. Because after all, living in a refugee camp is not a pleasant thing. No matter how large a cage it is, a canary wants to be free.
But freedom can carry a high price in Afghanistan. Through a UN-sponsored program, refugees are warned of the dangers which lie in wait for them in their homeland.
کس چې پس راغلی دا راچوتی نو هغه څه کوي هغه هم وژني او یا یې زخمي کوي اوس دې خوا راځئ موږ مخکې ویلي که نه چې ماین په څو ترې غولونکی دا موږ تشریح کړی چې غولونکی دا هم په ظاهره باندې بیا دا ګړۍ چې موږ کله داسې راچوتو لکه دا ګړۍ هم داسې راچوت کړه نو هلته د ماین د تاتار راوځي او کله چې دا تار راوځي نو بیا څه کوي ماین چاودنه کوي غولونکی دا هم خو وپېژندو که نه دا غولونکی دا مو لکه غولونکی.
Refugees are warned about booby traps and unexploded bombs.
But
the main threat comes from mines.
ما ان تاسو مخکې ویلي چې ما ان په څو طریقو باندې چاودنه کوي په 5 طریقو نو یوه طریقو خو ما هغه ته وویله چې د فشار د کمولو په واسطه باندې نو راشي یو انسان روان دی په دې باندې داسې خپه کېږي نو څه کوي چاودنه کوي پوه شوې په دې باندې اوس مخکې راځئ اوس دا ماین پروت دی که نه فرض که دا ماین پروت دی
Back in Afghanistan, there are other dangers. Even in the so-called liberated areas, rival groups of Mujahideen fighters compete for control. And the war continues. The Mujahideen, still funded by the West, launch a rocket attack on the city of Jalalabad. The regime responds with Soviet shells. There's no end in sight to the war. Afghanistan has always been a poor country. Now it lies devastated. These are the conditions which face refugees wanting to return to Nangarhar province. The war drove out half its inhabitants, 500,000 refugees.
یو شمه نور نه دی وړه د شپې ته وته کله دا اته کسه فامیل میستره نور مته شم دی وړه
63-year-old refugee Mohammed Alam has returned to Afghanistan to see if it is possible to bring his family back. The prospects are bleak.
مخفل کلی باره کې بس یا بدل دی ځکه څوکم تاسو په خپل وګورئ چې ورته نظر نه وباسئ خټې په پیسو کېږي ها تیګه یا خټه مثال چې په پیسو کېږي پیسې پاکستان د دیارانه به ته ځان وساتې که هم نو کور به جوړ کړي بیا چې راشي ځمکه به کرې که نه په څه شي کولبه اخلي کولبه خو په څه کېږي هسې خو څوک نه درکړي موږ خپل ته یو سر او دوه غوږی
For refugees to go home after a decade or more of civil war tends to mean they go home to a homeland or home area which is entirely devastated. Bridges are blown, hospitals have ceased to exist, there is no veterinary system, there is no cropping system, agriculture has been disrupted and so forth.
Returnees invariably find their homes in ruins.
بمینه ریچول او دا غټ بم وګوره د دلته کې بم وګوره دا وګوره دا ټل کورونه چړنګ شوی د بمې د واجنه ډنګ دي اتی په واجنه اوس بازار نه بیت پروشته سکاتو بمینه او د انداشنه دا کاروبار شروع کړو بس هغه د واجنه چې موږ وروړو د ټنګینه سره اصل دا په دا شی ختم او دا کاروبار وو کاډ نشته بل دا حالت چې وب نشته بل دا حالت چې ون نشته بل دا حالت چې کورونه نشته زمکه شاړه ده او ټول خلک چې نرسي د بامې د واجنه د خطر د واجنه کرا او دلته ضرورت خو کوم نه هو اکثر شي ته ضرورت نه کوم شي زته کو خیم کرا دا شای نشته ضرورت نه کوټه ته ضرورت ہے موټر ته ضرورت ہے مثال پټینی ته ضرورت ہے خیمه ته ضرورت ہے غله ته ضرورت ہے ځکه چې په خلوا هیڅ شای نشته ګر چی ته ضرورت ہے بوره ته ضرورت ہے ګوړه ته ضرورت ہے پیسې ته ضرورت ہے ډېر کنه ار څه چې کېږي په پیسې سره کېږي
The most basic need is water. Irrigation canals, which once supported thriving agriculture, have been systematically destroyed. Now, ditch water has to serve as drinking water. Some refugees are still not deterred from returning to Afghanistan.
زه د شي ته ضرورت لرم چې ماته کور پټ شي ولا راځي شي او بو بيږي او بل دای ما کلا او بوري او لوی باغ را نه وړای دی واج راند را نه وړي.
His home is also surrounded by mines.
دا چې کوم ځای کې پرسنلونه دي یا ماینونه دي دا موږ ته معلوم دي هغه ځای ته موږ نه ځو نه حیوانان پرېږدو نه موږ خپل ورځو چې کوم ځای کې ماینونه نه دي هغه ځای کې موږ ګرځو.
But not everyone knows where the mines are hidden. John Hayward, an aid worker with the Norwegian Committee, witnessed what mines did to these internal refugees.
It seemed that they had come back just after lunchtime, sort of 1 or 2 o'clock. They'd been poking around the villages. The first instance, the child had stepped on a mine and had one leg blown off and the other one opened up. The father was dead. The second instance, no one quite knows what's happened, but they disturbed one of these bomblets. It exploded. 2 children dead and 2 injured. There are places like this all over Afghanistan. I mean, places which are just complete death traps. If you tried to get the 3.5 million refugees, which are in Pakistan at the moment, going back to their villages in the border provinces, many of which are mined, you're talking of thousands of people dying. I mean, there are people dying in Afghanistan through mines and unexploded ordnance every day.
Inside Afghanistan, Mujahideen prayers are interrupted by the arrival of an ambulance run by the British charity Afghan Aid. Two young children, already orphaned by the war, have now been seriously injured after picking up an unexploded cluster bomb.
Locoplast.
Locoplast.
The explosion has resulted in severe abdominal injuries to 6-year-old Nogulab Helal. Mohammed, his 9-year-old brother, will probably lose an eye. The war in Afghanistan is sending Pakistan 2 more refugees. The Helal brothers from Afghanistan are now in intensive care.
مال دی ولې وکنه وغړ له شمالي خوا طرف نه وکنه بمبا تیارو بمباری کړی و دا غنه درې ولې وکړه څلور مخکې بمباری کړی په پیلا پیران نو چې سان دروغ کوم څه وګورم
خطا کړی و بار وخت سره وای دا غونډار سپیډ درکې به زه مو کې چې لا بر سره وای سره څنګه ماجیس خطا کې خپل کړو درا وایله مګر دا ایسته شتي دی په ځاله دا خپل کراره کور ته لاړو
The Red Cross also runs an orthopedic clinic in Peshawar. More than 50,000 Afghans have had one or more limbs amputated as a result of fighting and mines. Ten-year-old Kam Khan had his leg blown off in the road outside his house.
مینونه خطرات ده کنه ټول دنیا شړه پرته ده چاته بعضې سړی چې دی اوس خلقه دو ورځي چې دی او کنه خپل پټی کړي د چې تیرمې ته همداسې چاته ډاډه ورتلی شي
The United Nations Operation Salam trains refugees in demining. There are an estimated 30 million mines to be cleared from Afghanistan, a major obstacle to repatriation. But UNOCA, the United Nations body in charge of demining policy, has been criticized. Their first trainees were given metal detectors rather than mine detectors, a dangerous decision, according to the director of the Mines Advisory Group, Ray McGrath.
A real mine detector doesn't just detect the general presence of metal. It picks up to varying degrees, depending on the type of detector, on the metallic signature that's provided by the mine. Now, some mines, a lot of them in Afghanistan, particularly the Italian type of mines, have a very low metallic signature. These could not be detected, and you couldn't pinpoint the location of such a mine with one of these devices.
In practice, a mine detector is a metal detector. It's slightly more sophisticated than the one you can buy in your hardware store, but it achieves the same function. It detects little pieces of metal in the ground. That's all a mine detector does. It's nothing more magical than that.
The UN showed how serious they were about clearing mines in Afghanistan by going out and buying hundreds of these things and handing them out to people who they'd trained on the 2-week training course. And of course, the really good thing was that these people never went and tried to find mines with them. They'd have died had they done so.
UNOCA's trainees are now professionally equipped to detect such mines. And it is also considering funding an American project which trains dogs to sniff out the explosive in plastic mines. According to the Mines Advisory Group's survey of Afghanistan, it could take another 1,000 years to rid the country of its mines at the present rates of clearance. The program is underfunded. Of the $18 million UNOCA needed this year, only $9 million have so far been pledged.
There's never any compunction about spending billions of dollars on arming countries, on providing ways of killing and maiming people. When it actually comes to stopping people getting maimed when the war's finished, there's not as many votes in it. And I think that's what it comes down to. It's a UN responsibility, but more than that, it's a human responsibility to force governments to give the money that's required to clear these mines away. Otherwise, forget about your agricultural programs, your ceasefires and everything else, because none of it means a tiny bit of difference to the poor people who have to go back to their normal lives farming in areas that are essentially huge minefields.
So why is UNHCR offering repatriation grants to refugees who could be returning to unsafe areas in Afghanistan? The answer may lie in Geneva. By 1990, disillusioned donors who financed the UNHCR were demanding results. In particular, Japan refused to release $43 million until substantial repatriation was seen to be taking place.
The donors, the people who gave the money, had been promised time and time again that next week, next month, next year, the refugees were going to return. These promises were made in Geneva and New York. They were never made based on what you could find out from the refugee camps. The problem, of course, is that having made those promises to the donors, they had to deliver.
I wouldn't deny the fact that there was some pressure from donors to show repatriation. That also some of the funding for the rehabilitation in Afghanistan was directly tied to a major repatriation. But on our part, I don't think that played a major role in implementing this scheme or starting this scheme.
But the repatriation project also appears to ignore UNHCR's own guidelines on returns. These call for repatriation to be carried out under conditions of absolute safety.
Under the Geneva Accords, like any other arrangements for refugees, they are expected to return voluntarily in peace and security. I mean, these are nice sounding words. It's the ideal situation where there's an end of a war and you try to make sure that people go back in peace, tranquility, whatever. But there is one thing you have to remember, that there is an ongoing war in Afghanistan. This is the reason why, despite of what people say, I am not as disappointed as some of my other colleagues that people don't go back. It is not fair to ask people to go back when there is no guarantee.
The motivation for the pilot project was not to, let's say, unduly encourage people to return, but to respond to requests which came from Afghan refugees who wanted to return.
The new High Commissioner for Refugees goes further, a commitment to encourage repatriation without guarantees.
We're not guaranteeing safety. We are leaving that to the judgment of the refugees. We're not forcing them to go back, but we are encouraging them to go back if they judge that to be safe and to their interest.
This is irresponsible, and it's not the kind of job that you expect the UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, who's meant to be protecting these people, to be doing. Take the instance of Kandahar province. Kandahar province and the Mines Advisory Group survey and subsequently work of the UN's own funded project, the Mine Clearance Planning Agency, has shown that Kandahar is heavily mined. They wanted refugees to return in large numbers to Kandahar.
The refugees stayed, despite UNOCA's mine clearance efforts in Kandahar. The rehabilitation of Afghanistan remains underfunded. This year, UNOCA was forced to cut its projected spending by $31 million.
The holding back of funds for the rehabilitation of Afghanistan pending refugee return is unfortunately, in our view, a bit putting the cart before the horse. Because in our view, the refugees will not be enticed to go back until they see substantial rehabilitation taking place in the areas which they came from. Nobody wants to go back to a destroyed village, to an area where there is no running water supply, where the fields are littered with mines, and so on.
Akbar, which coordinates the Afghan relief work of 63 agencies, feels more should be done to rebuild Afghanistan.
Let me be absolutely clear about this. There is not too much work going on in Afghanistan. There's actually too little work going on. And there are so many areas that are just not covered at all by any aid agency. It's really a question of access. Some areas are easier to get to than others.
Mining and bombing of roads has forced aid agencies to find alternative routes across the border. There has been some rehabilitation inside Afghanistan, and aid agencies, backed by Operation Salam, have had their successes. In Kunar province, land which had become barren is fertile again. This was one of several areas which UNOCA described as zones of tranquility, in the belief that the war had moved elsewhere.
The war is basically over, and has been over for 2.5 years in many parts of Afghanistan. And the idea of zones of tranquility was an attempt to describe this phenomenon. What happened was that people thought that the United Nations was declaring that such a place was a zone of tranquility. Well, the next day, a bomb was dropped, and so it obviously wasn't a zone of tranquility. And so I think we found that the concept wasn't as useful as had originally been thought.
Kunar's tranquility was shattered in April this year. A series of explosions, said to have been triggered by a government Scud missile, killed more than 300 people in its capital, Asadabad. The rehabilitation of Kunar was one of the great hopes for mass repatriation. Instead, the return of the war has generated yet more refugees.
د بین الملل په ترو باندې د پاسونه راشن پاسونه اخیستل هغه بعضې کسان لاړ او بیا د سکټو د تیارو د بمبار په خاطر باندې بیرته دغه شول ده بیرته یې هجرت وکړو راغلو اوس هم چې پاسونه هم ورسره نشته راشن هم نه ورکول کېږي او خواران ډېر په تکلیف سره دي اول ته د بمبار او د سکټ خاطر هم ژوند نشي کولی نو په دې خاطر باندې افغانستان ته تلل مشکل دي.
But in Pakistan, 3 million refugees are under increasing pressure to go back to Afghanistan. Official food aid to refugees is being systematically cut. These handouts come not from a UN agency, but from the Saudi Relief Committee. Refugees now receive only edible oil and wheat, where once they received 5 food items. This year, their wheat ration was reduced by 20%. Even this reduced ration fails to arrive regularly in the camps. But the situation is set to get worse. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has stated that aid for the Afghans is coming to an end.
My predecessor, Mr. Stoltenberg, made a statement that we will be phasing out in 3 years' time. I think he is right in saying that we cannot be there forever, because this is with regards to the Afghan refugees in Pakistan. The number is large. They have been there for over 10 years. The amount of assistance that we are giving to each Afghan refugee is very small. And we cannot maintain that program forever.
With the official confirmation that UNHCR is phasing out aid to the Afghan refugees, what will be the impact on the host country, Pakistan?
As the aid basket shrinks, more refugees would be tempted to move into the cities. But that's not a happy situation, because even in the cities, we don't have much to offer to them. It's a poor country. The prospects for the future are not very bright. If the aid continues to reduce and the population continues to rise, Pakistan government and the people will have to carry more burden which they may not be able to carry, and that would lead us into a situation of having a population which is totally uncatered for.
Conditions are already deteriorating. The water supply to Ragahan camp was recently cut off, forcing refugees to rely on pumps. There is little prospect of improvement in camp conditions, while donors are insisting that refugees should go home.
What we like to do is to keep Afghanistan alive in the public opinion, and also to try to impress on donors that it will be a fatal mistake to abandon Afghans now at this crucial hour of their lives. Because it is not just Afghanistan we have to think about. It will have serious regional implications.
The traditional gun culture of Pakistan's northwest frontier province has flourished during the 12 years of the Afghan war. The street price for a Kalashnikov, £75. The fear is that the international community will walk away from the Afghan refugees, leaving Peshawar to become the next Beirut.
The refugees would become increasingly impatient. They would become restive. They would become hungry, and they would get involved in organized crimes, maybe also in terrorism and sabotage. So those are my worst fears. I hope that before that takes place, before that happens, some settlement would have been reached.
The prospects for a settlement, however, are remote. The donors want to be rid of their commitment to the Afghans, but it's too dangerous for the refugees to return. Meanwhile, life in the camps deteriorates.
The superpowers, having spent so many billions of dollars on the destruction of the country, should certainly bear a moral responsibility for the reconstruction of the country. And for a mere fraction of the cost of the weaponry that's gone into Afghanistan, we could have an effective and long-lasting program of development and reconstruction in Afghanistan. And unfortunately, this has not yet occurred.
Repatriation, of course, is the best solution. And we have a number of situations in the world now where repatriation is possible. The situation in Afghanistan is the largest, but also coming up will be Cambodia and Central America. There's been repatriation. The difficulty with repatriation is that it really is a great deal more expensive than taking care of people in camps. We're seeing very little energy being put into repatriation and reconstruction. But unless we do repatriation effectively, the countries themselves are not going to be able to recover from the wars, and the people are likely to be a source of difficulty and create conflict in the future.
Repatriation can be viewed as a cheap option. If that is the way the world community chooses to view it, it is missing a big opportunity for a better world tomorrow. In fact, repatriation that doesn't work will produce conflict and future refugees and internally displaced people. That's not the kind of repatriation that is a solution. It's only a prelude to further problems.
Next week's concluding program looks at the welcome offered to refugees in the West and asks what the wealthiest nations in the world are doing to address the problems. The Dispossessed, next Wednesday at 9. To complement this series, the current special edition of New Internationalist contains further information and articles. For your copy, send a cheque or postal order payable to Channel 4 to The Dispossessed, P.O. Box 4000, London W3 6XJ. Copies are also available from Help the Aged. Tomorrow evening's Critical Eye takes a tough look at society's attitudes to female offenders through the eyes of former prisoners. They reenact their experiences of British jails and the male-dominated justice system that put them there. Picking Oakham, a drama documentary, is tomorrow's Critical Eye at 9.